My wife and I got married in 2004. At that time, a polymer plant in the Tamaulipas area had been contracted. We set about looking for a house in the surrounding area. These were the northern colonies of Tampico. We abandoned our search when we found a house that surprised us greatly at its price, since it was quite spacious, had a garage and a backyard. It was so cheap, so we had no objection to buying it in cash. It would be perfectly enough to furnish it. In addition, we were very happy because we would start fixing and making minor repairs, but it would only need paint and some plants to make it more comfortable. It was one night when our hell began. We were sleeping when suddenly a noise of something being squeezed woke us up abruptly with a loud bang, so we stood up and remained silent. Nothing else happened. My wife, frightened, told me to go check it out. With some fear I stood up to see what had happened. Maybe someone had broken in, and as it was a very popular neighborhood, I thought it was worth thieves, but not full of broken windows and objects inside the house. I checked that the doors were closed and went back to the room. My wife calmed down a bit and we went to bed again. At that moment, when I was just falling asleep again, we heard the sound of something breaking again, but this time it was louder. It hadn't been our imagination. True, we had heard that, so we both got up and turned on the light. It was forest all around the house. The source of the noise, I didn't hear anything out of place. Surprised, I was about to go back to the room when I felt a cold air on my bare feet. When I turned around, I saw the living room window to see if it was closed, and suddenly an electric current ran through my body. There was a person standing outside in the yard of the house. It was a strange scene, with disheveled hair and a face full of wrinkles. He had no teeth and his skin was brown as if he were rotting. He looked quite sinister. I felt even more panicked when I heard my wife's screams that alerted me. I ran to the room to see what was happening, and she was crying, terrified, crouching beside the bed. When I asked her what was wrong, trembling, she told me that she had seen a horrible old man through the window, who was looking at her, smiling with a toothless mouth. At that moment I took a hammer, opened the door and ran to the street to look for what we had seen. I ran to the corner several times, but there was nothing. The dogs in the block started to come into my presence, so I decided to go back to the house. When I arrived, I tried to calm my husband, but the truth is that we were on edge. We tried to sleep, but it was impossible. When morning came, we had breakfast and did not talk about the matter. We tried to tell each other things and not think about what we had seen. I went to work, and when I came back at night, the tension started again. We were not sleepy, and we were a little nervous thinking about the event we had experienced, so I wanted to calm my wife down a little, and we sat in the living room to watch television. Suddenly, the power went out in the whole neighborhood. It was a common thing in those areas for that to happen, so I went to get a lamp and went out to check. Sure enough, everything was in total darkness. The neighbors could be seen in the distance with their flashlights, and the dogs were barking incessantly. He lit a cigarette and went back to the living room. I went to the kitchen to get some candles and other lamps. On the way I saw the shadow of my wife sitting in the armchair in the living room without saying anything. I just saw her. I said to her reluctantly, "Fatty, I think the power went out in the whole neighborhood." When I entered the kitchen, I saw this because my wife was there and he was moving around in some candles. Then he said to me, "Yes, I saw that he went everywhere." A shiver ran through me. I felt a shock of fear in my head. I felt a bad feeling in my stomach. I took a large lamp and I didn't tell my wife anything about what I had seen. I just told her to wait for me, and he looked for more candles, began to pray, the only thing he knew, and thought about what he was going to find in the living room. But when I illuminated the whole place, there was absolutely no one. At that moment, my wife came with the candles and put them on the center table. The lights came back soon and we turned off the candles and I went to the bedroom. She stayed watching television in the living room, but I couldn't sleep. Then she began to think that there was something strange in the house. That was the reason why the owners had sold it to us so cheap, I thought. In all things ghostly, demons and worse. I was not a believer in these things, but my wife was, and she had told me stories. I tried not to get influenced by all this, but it was likely that something was stalking us. It was early in the morning when I woke up shivering from the cold, that is, an unusual cold in the room, and it was February and the weather was bad, but not so bad that I felt that kind of cold. To see that my wife was covered from the bird lying on her back, so I simply took the quilt, covered her and went out to smoke. I went to the kitchen and to my surprise my wife was there too, smoking a cigarette. It was my surprised face that made my wife miss me, and before I could say anything, she said something even more chilling. "Why did you get up? You left me alone on the sofa. It scares sleep when you get up to go to bed," she said disdainfully. "I did. Don't pretend I was asleep and I was with you, but you were frozen. I told you and you almost stood up. If you went to the bedroom, Fatso, I haven't left the room. I thought you were there. I covered you because you were cold. At that moment we both began to panic. We saw each other, we saw what was happening, we turned off the light. I know my wife was scared. We went to the bedroom, we needed to see who or what was in the bed. We slowly walked without making noise and opened the bedroom door. On the bed there was a lump lying and covered with the quilt. Slowly I approached to uncover it and see who was there, and my wife was on the verge of collapse with a voice interrupted by whimpering. She told me not to do it, and when she pushed the quilt aside, an indescribable terror invaded us both. She started screaming desperately and ran out of the house. I stood petrified, seeing the sinister old woman lying down and seeing me with her wrinkled face and rotten skin and that toothless smile that made my heart race even more. That was how she saw me and slowly covered herself again, and after the lump, she simply disappeared before my eyes. The quilt was spread out on the bed. And at that moment I walked out of my house looking for my wife. I was pale and she was in total hysteria. No, what was that? Let's go now. I was gone, and if it weren't for my wife's slaps, I wouldn't have reacted immediately and I wouldn't have run with her to find a taxi. We continued, we were in bedclothes as best we could. We ran a long distance to the entrance of the subdivision, got into a taxi, went to her mother's house, and there we told my in-laws and brothers-in-law what had happened in the morning. We returned with my wife and, accompanied by my brother-in-law and his girlfriend, we found the house closed between us and we looked everywhere for any sign of witchcraft, strange things, but in the end we found nothing. At one point my wife started telling me to leave everything and go rent. I refused and did not want to leave the property for something like that. She looked at me and told me with determination that it would be living in her mother's house, who was what she had to do so that things would improve and so that she would not feel all that. She did not want to stay, and I understood her. I was too scared, so I had to stay alone in that place. The first thing I did was call the man who sold me the house to meet with him, and I told him what had happened to me. He laughed at me, said he did not know anything about what I was talking about. However, I noticed a tension in his voice and he changed the subject. I knew he was lying, and I knew that somehow he and his family had experienced, I don't know to what extent, the intrusion and the manifestations. For that reason they sold us the house so cheaply. What is this about? It has such a terrible story that I would never know. The atmosphere was suffocating, quite cold, and something was perceived that was not right. Talking with my coworkers, they recommended that I bring a healer, someone to bless the house. They told me about a supposed witch who lived in Monte Alto, so I went to look for him. I took him to the place. As soon as he entered, he said that he felt the presence of evil and advised me to leave the house. I, in an annoyed tone, told him to do what he had to do and that his advice was of no use to me. The man took out a bunch of strange esoteric things from a backpack, liquids, which he began to sprinkle throughout the house. He lit coal with herbs and thus he passed everything to a remote control. The stench was unbearable, and after a long rest he said to me, "You perhaps stamp, the evil presence is gone." I paid him for the service, he left, and honestly I did not want to test what he had done, but honestly I had nowhere to go. I was terribly scared and did not want night to come, so whether I left or not, I was seen with a bottle of vodka to give me courage. That night I was in my living room with the television on and I drank one drink after another, and after midnight I finally fell asleep. In the early morning I woke up abruptly and had the need to urinate, so I got up heavily, and while I was doing my business, I heard the insistent knocking on the door. After resting from reading, I went to see who was knocking so insistently. When I looked through the peephole of the door, I could see with strangeness that it was the wife was standing there in the light with a disfigured face. The poet opened it. I tried to hug her. However, she passed by, went into the bedroom, and having done this, locked the door. Then I realized that I was lending alcohol, and that made her furious. I assumed that I would sleep on the sofa, but at least I was calm to have my wife with me. The morning light penetrated me as I opened my eyes. As soon as I heard the phone ring, I stood up in a hurry and answered. "Well, why aren't you answering?" "I've been dialing." "How are you?" "Who's calling?" "Well, I'm in Otto." "Wife, who do you think it is?" At that moment I felt a terrible fear. I started to sweat cold, left the phone and ran out of the house. When I looked out of my bedroom window, there I could see her. The old lady was already looking at me through the curtains, with her hair disheveled, with her mouth devoid of teeth, smiling at me. After a while, the curtain was drawn and she disappeared out of nowhere. For me that was enough. I had already witnessed too many paranormal phenomena that end up folding my hands, and I went to get my wife and we started renting a house. Property in a new condominium in Altamira. I put the house up for sale at the same price I bought it, so somehow I wouldn't lose the money. I never said anything to the new owners about the paranormal situation in the house. All I wanted was to get my money back and forget about the matter. Sometime later I learned from the newspaper that the house had been sent away for some undetermined reason. I saw the photo and, indeed, where my room was, it was completely burned, according to the testimony of the lady who avoided it and had an altar with several all and that it began to burn from the ship, that the fire spread throughout the room. I, trying not to think, looked at the photo timidly and, between the black of the ink, I could make out a faint gray figure inside the burned room, a blurred spot that seemed to be an old woman without teeth and smiling.